When the attorney reached the final page, the room grew quiet for the wrong reason. Ethan Walker sat at the far end of the long oak table with one hand resting on the head of his German shepherd, Maverick, and listened as his own name disappeared from the life of the only man in the family who had ever made him feel welcome. Rain moved down the tall windows of Bennett and Price Law Office in thin gray threads, turning the streets of Harbor Falls into a blur of wet brick, parked trucks, and trembling traffic lights. Outside, northern Michigan was sinking into late October, all cold lake air and pine smoke, but inside the conference room the air felt even colder, polished, clean, and formal, the kind of cold that belongs to rooms where people say painful things in careful voices. Ethan was 40 years old, a white American veteran with broad shoulders, a weathered face, short dark blonde hair, pale gray eyes, a white scar near his left eyebrow, and light stubble along a jaw that had learned to hold silence better than anger. He wore a worn denim shirt beneath a faded field jacket, both clean but old, the cuffs soft from years of work and weather. His boots were brushed as best he could manage, though mud still clung stubbornly near the soles. He had slept the night before in his old blue pickup behind a closed bait shop, with Maverick curled on the passenger seat and a wool blanket pulled over both of them when the temperature dropped into the low 40-degree range. Across the table, Walter Bennett's relatives sat in dark coats and sharper shoes, people Ethan had seen only at holidays, hospital rooms, and the kind of family gatherings where kindness arrived late and left early. Darren Bennett, Walter's nephew, leaned back with a look of patient victory, his fingers folded over a gold watch that caught the ceiling light. Beside him, two cousins whispered softly whenever the attorney turned a page. Ethan did not look at them. He looked at the box in the corner. It was small, made of dark walnut, with brass hinges and a worn leather handle, the kind of box an old man might keep under a bed for things too personal to leave in a drawer. It had belonged to Walter. Ethan remembered seeing it once beside the old man's radio, closed, dusted, and treated with the respect of something that held more memory than money. Maverick had noticed it too. The 6-year-old German shepherd, sable-antan with a black saddle across his back, cream along his chest, a silver-touched muzzle, amber eyes, and a simple working dog harness, had been calm through the reading at first. He had ignored the shifting chairs, the perfume, the rain tapping on glass, the dry legal language. But when the attorney paused over the final paragraph, Maverick lifted his head. Mr. Harold Price adjusted his glasses and read the line again, slower this time, as though the words themselves had embarrassed him. Ethan Walker, formerly named as a beneficiary in prior drafts, is hereby omitted from the final distribution of the estate. Something in the room changed. No one gasped. That would have been easier. Instead, there was a small settling of bodies, a quiet release of breath, the soft scrape of Darren's shoe beneath the table. Ethan felt it all without moving. He had carried Walter to doctor appointments through 2 winters. He had repaired the old man's gutters, changed furnace filters, split firewood, fixed the porch steps, and sat beside him on evenings when the lake wind made his bones ache. He had not done those things for a house, a check, or a name on paper. Still, being erased had a sound, and it was quieter than he expected. His fingers slid through the fur between Maverick's ears. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though he was not sure which of them needed the words more. Harold Price lowered the document, and gave Ethan a look that held apology but no power. "I am sorry, Mr. Walker. This appears to be the executed version on file." Darren cleared his throat. "Uncle Walter made his wishes clear," he said, smoothing his tie with 2 fingers. Ethan turned his eyes toward him, not sharply, not with accusation, only steadily. "I hope he did," Ethan said. The answer took the room out of Darren's mouth for a moment. Then Maverick stood. His movement was not sudden, but it carried such certainty that every person at the table looked down. The dog stepped away from Ethan's chair, crossed the carpet with quiet, deliberate pause, and stopped in front of Walter's walnut box in the corner. His ears rose. His nose hovered above the brass latch. Then he gave 3 short barks, clear and measured, not loud enough to frighten anyone, but strong enough to make Harold Price set the wool flat on the table. Ethan's hand went still. He knew that signal. Maverick had used it only when something mattered. Not danger. Not fear. Discovery. The attorney frowned and stood slowly. That box was delivered with the estate items this morning, he said. It was not listed for distribution, only storage. Darren pushed back his chair. That is family property. Harold did not answer him. Maverick did not move. He simply looked back at Ethan with amber eyes bright beneath the office light, as if he had heard a voice no one else had been willing to hear. Ethan rose from his chair, every old ache in him suddenly awake, and walked toward the box. Rain tapped harder against the windows, and somewhere beyond the glass the lake wind pressed through town like a message looking for a door. Harold Price reached the walnut box before Ethan did, not quickly, but with the cautious respect of a man who had spent his life around last wishes and knew they sometimes carried more weight than law books. The brass latch gave a soft click under his thumb. Everyone in the conference room seemed to lean toward it without meaning to, even Darren Bennett, whose face had tightened into the expression of someone watching a locked gate open on land he thought he already owned. Inside the box were no bundles of cash, no jewelry, no deed folded in ribbon. There was only an old lake photograph, a tarnished key on a faded blue string, and a small envelope with Ethan Walker written across the front in Walter Bennett's careful hand. For a moment, Ethan did not reach for it. The sight of that handwriting moved him backward in time more powerfully than any spoken memory could have. He saw Walter's kitchen in winter, the one with yellowed curtains and a radio that needed 3 taps before it would catch the Tigers' game. He saw the old man sitting at the table in a plaid robe, one hand around a mug of black coffee, the other tapping along to a hymn playing low through the static. Back then, Ethan had still been trying to pretend he was only stopping by for repairs. A loose gutter. A furnace filter. A porch step that sagged near the rail. But one task became another, and another became a habit, until winter evenings found him splitting firewood behind Walter's house while Maverick lay near the back door, keeping watch over both of them as if the small property were a post he had been assigned by heaven itself. Walter had never asked Ethan about the war directly. He had never said things like "you must have seen a lot" or "I bet it was hard," the way strangers did when they wanted pain to become conversation. Walter had simply made room for silence. He would set out 2 mugs, leave the radio low, and point toward whatever needed fixing. The shed latch sticks. The basement pipe knocks when the wind comes off the lake. The north window will not close right. Ethan fixed them because he knew how. He stayed because Walter never made him explain why he did not have anywhere better to go. Some nights, when snow pressed against the windows and the old furnace breathed like a tired animal, Walter spoke of Lake Wren. He described it as if it were not just a place, but an old promise hidden among pines. A narrow road curling down to black water. A forgotten cabin with a green door. A little dock that faced west, where the sunset came down like warm brass over the lake. "My brother and I used to fish there before the world got so noisy," Walter once said. "Later, I went there when I needed to remember who I was before people started telling me." Ethan had been repairing the hinge on a kitchen cabinet at the time, one knee on the floor, screwdriver in hand. "Sounds peaceful," he said. Walter looked out the window where snow was gathering on the sill. "Peaceful is not the same as empty," he answered. "Some places wait because somebody asked them to." Ethan had not understood the sentence then. He had only nodded, the way a man nods when he suspects another man is speaking from a room inside himself no visitor should enter without permission. Maverick had understood more. The dog would always lift his head at the words Lake Wren, ears forward, eyes bright, as if the name carried a frequency too fine for people. That was how Walter first noticed him. "That shepherd listens with his bones," he said one evening, smiling faintly while Maverick rested his chin on Ethan's boot. "Better than most men listen with both ears." Over the years, Walter grew thinner. His steps became shorter. Ethan drove him to appointments, carried groceries, cleaned gutters, and once spent a whole Saturday patching the roof while cold rain soaked through his jacket. Walter tried to pay him more than the work was worth, but Ethan would only take enough for gas and dog food. "You are stubborn," Walter told him. Ethan answered, I learned from the best. The old man laughed so hard he had to sit down, and for one brief moment the house felt less like a place where someone was aging alone and more like a home still practicing how to be full. Back in the law office, the memory faded into rain, polished wood, and the sound of Darren shifting behind him. Ethan finally took the envelope. The paper was warm from Harold's hand and fragile at the edges. Maverick stood close, his shoulder brushing Ethan's leg, steady and certain. Harold cleared his throat gently. Walter instructed that this be given to you only after the will was read in full. Darren stepped forward. If it concerns the estate, we have a right to hear it. Ethan looked at the envelope, then at the old photograph inside the box. A small cabin stood beside a dark lake, half hidden by pines, its green door barely visible beneath the shadow of the porch roof. The dock in the picture leaned slightly into the water, and at the end of it someone had drawn a small mark in blue ink, almost like an arrow. Ethan felt Maverick's breath change beside him. The dog was not looking at Darren. He was staring at the lake in the photograph. Harold lowered his voice. Mr. Walker, whatever this is, Walter meant it for you. Ethan slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of his faded field jacket, not out of greed, but because some things given by the dying should not be opened under the eyes of people waiting to measure their value. As he turned to leave, the rain against the windows softened, and the lake wind outside seemed to move through town with the patience of something that had waited a long time to be found. Ethan did not open Walter's envelope until he was back inside the old blue pickup with the doors locked, the windows fogging at the edges, and Maverick sitting close enough that the dog's shoulder pressed against his ribs. The law office stood across the street behind a curtain of rain, its tall windows glowing with the clean yellow light of people who still had business to finish. Inside, Walter's relatives were probably signing papers, collecting copies, arranging keys, and speaking in low, satisfied voices about lake frontage, bank accounts, furniture, tools, and the family house where Ethan had replaced the furnace filter more times than anyone else in that room could remember. He did not resent the house. Houses had their own grief. He only wondered how a man could spend years holding a ladder steady for someone, carrying groceries through snow, sitting beside a hospital bed at 2 a.m, and still become invisible when ink met paper. Rain ticked softly on the roof of the pickup. The sound was steady and small, like fingernails brushing a window from the outside. Maverick lowered his muzzle toward Ethan's jacket pocket and gave one quiet breath. Ethan looked down at him. You already know, do you not, boy? The German shepherd's amber eyes did not blink. Ethan took out the envelope. Walter's handwriting crossed the front in blue ink, slightly slanted, firm despite the tremor that had entered his hand during the last winter. Ethan ran his thumb over his own name, and the ache in his chest changed shape. It was no longer only humiliation. It was something older, something softer, like standing at the edge of a closed door and hearing warmth on the other side. He opened the flap carefully. Inside was the photograph from the walnut box, a narrow strip of hand-drawn map folded twice, and a single sheet of stationery that smelled faintly of cedar, pipe tobacco, and the lemon oil Walter used on every piece of wood he owned. Ethan unfolded the letter first. There were only 2 lines. If they erase your name, let Maverick find what ink cannot hide. Go to the water before the first hard frost. Ethan read the words once, then again, while the rain blurred the streetlights into pale halos beyond the windshield. He did not understand how Walter could have written Maverick's name unless he had planned this long before the final version of the will was read. He did not understand why the old man would hide anything behind a sentence that sounded less like instruction and more like prayer. But he understood one thing with painful clarity. Walter had known. He had known Ethan might sit in that room and hear himself removed. He had known the silence that would follow. He had left something small enough to be mocked and strange enough to be ignored by people who only searched for value in numbers. Ethan unfolded the map. It was not professionally drawn. It was Walter's work, made with a steady pencil and small notes in the margins. The road north from Harbor Falls. The turn after St. Agnes Church. The gravel cut off near a broken mile marker. A bend labeled Old Pine Stand. Then Lake Wren, shaped like a cupped hand, with a tiny square on the western shore marked in blue ink. Beneath it Walter had written, "The green door still remembers." Maverick leaned forward and touched the edge of the map with his nose. His ears lifted high. A low sound moved in his chest, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but the same deep attention Ethan had seen in him when the dog found a missing hiker's glove in wet leaves 2 years earlier. Ethan held up the photograph. The cabin stood half hidden beneath tall pines, weathered but stubborn, its porch shadowed, its windows dark, its green door facing the lake as if waiting for someone across the water. The dock leaned slightly, with one board near the far end marked by that same blue arrow Ethan had noticed in the law office. Maverick stared at it so intently that his breath fogged the glossy paper. Ethan almost smiled, but the feeling did not make it all the way to his mouth. Behind him, the law office door opened. Through the rain-streaked rearview mirror, he saw Darren step onto the sidewalk beneath a black umbrella, speaking into a phone, his free hand cutting the air in small impatient motions. A cousin followed with a cardboard box of Walter's desk items. They did not look toward Ethan's truck. To them, he had already been settled, dismissed, filed away with the old drafts and useless sentimental things. Ethan folded the letter and map, placed them inside his jacket, and slipped the photograph into the visor above the windshield. For a long moment, he sat without starting the engine. He thought of Walter's voice on winter nights, saying that some places wait because somebody asked them to. He thought of the old man's thin hand resting on Maverick's head, calling him a shepherd who listened with his bones. Then he looked at the fuel gauge. Just over half a tank. Enough to go north. Enough, perhaps, to learn whether a forgotten lake cabin could hold the part of a man's love that a room full of relatives had failed to read. Maverick turned toward the road before the engine even started, body alert, eyes bright, as if the map had opened a path only he could already see. Ethan turned the key, and the pickup came alive with a tired rumble. As they pulled away from the curb, rain slid from the windshield in silver sheets, and Harbor Falls faded behind them like a chapter someone else had tried to close too soon. The road north narrowed after Harbor Falls, leaving behind the brick storefronts, the law office windows, and the damp little streets where Walter Bennett's name was already being folded into documents and quiet conversations. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel, following the hand-drawn map across the passenger seat, while Maverick sat beside it like a guardian assigned to paper and memory. The rain softened into mist as they climbed through the pine country, and the world outside the windshield turned to long gray lanes, dark trunks, and flashes of copper leaves clinging to the last bright edges of autumn. Every few miles, Ethan checked the old blue pickup's fuel gauge, then the road, then the photograph tucked beneath the visor. The cabin in the picture looked almost unreal now, a small green-doored place hidden by trees, waiting beside a lake Ethan had heard about for years but never seen. He did not expect riches there. He did not expect justice to appear with clean hands and a stamped seal. He only wanted to understand why Walter had sent him toward water after the family had sent him toward nothing. Near St. Agnes Church, the map told him to turn left where the pavement broke into gravel. The church itself stood white and weathered at the edge of a clearing, its steeple silvered by rain, its small bell motionless beneath a sky the color of pewter. Ethan slowed as they passed, and for a moment the old building reminded him of Walter's kitchen on Sunday mornings, the radio humming hymns through static while coffee darkened in the pot. Walter had believed in practical mercy. Fix the hinge. Clear the snow. Feed the dog. Call the lonely before evening. He had never spoken faith like a performance. He had lived it in chores. Maverick lifted his nose toward the churchyard and gave a quiet breath, then turned sharply toward the gravel road before Ethan even reached it. The dog's ears came forward, and the fur along his shoulders shifted with attention. Ethan followed the turn. The truck bounced over ruts filled with rainwater, past abandoned mailboxes and stretches of birch trees pale as bone. The farther they went, the less the map felt like directions and the more it felt like a memory Walter had placed in Ethan's hands piece by piece. Old Pine Stand came next, exactly where the pencil note said it would be, a grove of enormous red pines crowding the road, their high branches knitting together until the afternoon dimmed beneath them. The air changed there. Even through the truck vents, Ethan could smell cold needles, wet bark, and something broad and mineral beneath it all, the clean scent of open water. Maverick stood suddenly, front paws braced on the floorboard, body angled toward the windshield. "Easy," Ethan said, but his own voice was quieter than usual. At the end of the pine stand, the road dipped hard, curving around a slope thick with ferns and fallen leaves. Then the trees opened. Lake Wren appeared below them in a hollow of mist, dark and still, shaped like the cupped hand Walter had drawn on the map. The surface held the cloudy sky without a ripple, and along the western shore, half hidden by pines, stood the cabin. It was smaller than Ethan expected. Older, too. The roof sagged gently at one corner, moss gathered along the shingles, and the green door had faded to the color of sea glass left too long in the sun. A narrow dock reached into the lake at a tired angle, its boards silvered by weather, its posts dark at the waterline. Near the porch, a rusted wind chime hung from a bent hook, completely still. Ethan parked at the edge of the clearing and did not get out immediately. The engine ticked as it cooled. Mist moved through the trees. Maverick stared through the windshield without blinking. This was not the empty place Darren would have seen. Ethan knew that at once. Darren would have seen rotten boards, repair costs, no paved road, no easy sail. Ethan saw Walter's silence made visible. He saw a refuge disguised as neglect. When he stepped out, the ground was soft beneath his boots, layered with pine needles and damp leaves. Maverick jumped down and moved ahead, not running, not pulling, only following something with slow certainty. Ethan crossed to the porch and touched the railing. The wood was cold but not gone. Tired, maybe? Waiting, maybe? He tried the green door. Locked. The tarnished key from the walnut box slid into the old brass lock with a stubborn scrape, then turned. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, dust, lake air, and years of closed windows. A stone fireplace filled one wall. A plaid blanket lay folded over the back of a chair. On the mantel sat a small framed photograph of Walter as a younger man, standing on the dock with his sleeves rolled up and sunlight on his face. Ethan removed his cap without thinking. Maverick did not enter far. He walked to the middle of the room, turned toward the back window facing the lake, and froze. Outside, the dock waited in the mist. Then, though no wind touched the porch and no footstep near the door, the rusted wind chime gave one soft, broken note. The single note from the wind chime faded so gently that Ethan almost wondered if he had imagined it, but Maverick's body told him otherwise. The German shepherd stood in the center of the cabin with his ears high, his amber eyes fixed through the back window at the dock, every line of him alert and listening. Ethan stepped closer to the glass. Beyond the porch, Lake Wren lay dark and smooth beneath the mist, holding the pine trees in its surface as if the whole shore had been painted upside down. The dock reached out from the grass in a crooked line, gray boards silvered by weather, one post leaning toward the water like an old man tired of standing alone. Nothing moved. No bird crossed the lake. No branch shook. Yet the rusted wind chime on the porch gave another faint sound, not a melody, just a tired little ring, as if it had remembered its purpose for one breath and then forgotten again. Ethan turned back to the room. The cabin was small, but it had the strange dignity of a place kept alive by memory instead of use. Dust rested on the windowsills in soft bands. A tin coffee pot sat on the cold stove. A stack of firewood waited beside the hearth, dry and neatly split. On the wall near the door hung an old raincoat that still held the shape of Walter's shoulders. Ethan touched the sleeve with 2 fingers and felt a grief so quiet it did not ask to be named. Walter had been here. Not decades ago and forgotten, but often enough to leave order behind. Often enough to stack wood. Often enough to dust the photograph on the mantel and oil the lock before the cold could claim it. Ethan crossed to the fireplace, where soot darkened the stones in a careful half-moon. The mantel held 3 objects: the photograph of younger Walter on the dock, a smooth lake stone marked with a faded white cross, and a brass clock stopped at 2:17. Maverick walked to the hearth and sniffed along the bay stones, then stepped back and looked toward the back door. "Not yet," Ethan murmured, though he did not know why he said it. Maybe because the cabin felt like it deserved a greeting before being searched. He opened windows one by one, letting in the clean smell of wet pine, cold water, and old leaves. The stale air inside loosened. Curtains lifted slightly. The cabin seemed to exhale. As Ethan worked, he noticed small signs that someone had cared for the place without wanting anyone to notice. The roof had been patched from inside with clean boards. Mouse gaps had been sealed with tin. A stack of canned soup sat in a lower cabinet, not expired by more than a season. A folded note beside the sink simply read, "Leave it better than you found it," in Walter's hand. Ethan looked at the words for a long time. That had been Walter's way of saying almost everything. Near late afternoon, the sound of an engine approached slowly along the gravel road. Maverick turned toward the front door, calm but attentive. Ethan stepped onto the porch as an old green station wagon rolled into the clearing and stopped beside his pickup. A woman in her 70s climbed out carefully, wearing a quilted vest, rubber boots, and a knit hat the color of cranberry jam. She carried herself with the practical steadiness of someone who had lived near water long enough to trust weather more than promises. "You must be Ethan," she said. Her voice was warm but cautious. "I am Ruth Callahan. I live on the far side of the cove. Walter mentioned you more than once." Ethan came down the steps slowly. He did not know whether to feel comforted or exposed. "He did?" Ruth smiled toward Maverick, who had moved beside Ethan and sat with formal patience. "Mostly he mentioned the dog. Said that Shepard could hear truth under floorboards." Ethan glanced down at Maverick, then back to her. "Mrs. Callahan, do you know why Walter kept this place hidden from the family?" Ruth looked past him to the green door, and the smile faded into something gentler. "Because they would have sold it before sunset and called it practical. Walter came here every month until his legs made the walk too hard. Sometimes Harold Price drove him. Sometimes I brought groceries. He said this cabin was not property. It was a promise." Ethan felt the letter inside his jacket like a living coal. "A promise to whom?" Ruth looked toward the dock. "To men who came back from hard places and could not bear noisy rooms. To people who needed a lake more than advice. To one man in particular, I think, though Walter never said the name plainly." The wind moved then, barely enough to stir the pines. The wind chime gave another small note. Maverick stood at once and faced the dock. Ruth followed his gaze and grew very still. "Walter always said the chime would ring when the right person finally listened," she whispered. Ethan stepped off the porch into the damp grass. The sky over Lake Wren had turned the color of pewter, and a thin line of gold opened low in the west. Maverick began walking toward the dock, not fast, not uncertain, but with the steady purpose of a dog following a sound no human ear had earned yet. At the first board, he stopped, looked back at Ethan, and gave 3 quiet barks. Maverick's 3 quiet barks carried across Lake Wren and came back softened by mist, as if the water had heard them and returned only the part it wanted Ethan to understand. Ruth Callahan did not move from the porch. She held one hand against the railing, her cranberry-colored hat bright against the gray cabin wall, and watched the German shepherd with the solemn attention of someone who had waited years to see whether an old promise still knew how to breathe. Ethan stepped onto the first board of the dock and felt a dip beneath his weight. The wood was damp but not rotten through, tired rather than ruined, like the cabin itself. He tested the next board with his boot before trusting it, moving slowly because Walter had taught him that haste was how people missed the thing they were meant to find. Maverick went ahead only a few feet, then stopped near the middle of the dock where one plank bowed slightly upward at the edge. The dog lowered his nose, sniffed once, and placed a single paw on the board. A faint sound answered from below. Tap. Ethan froze. The lake around the dock was shallow near shore, no more than 2 or 3 feet deep, dark with old leaves and the shadows of the posts. The sound did not come again at first. Ethan knelt carefully, one hand braced on the wet rail, and looked through the narrow gap between the boards. Water moved in slow rings around the pilings. A few yellow leaves drifted beneath the surface. Nothing else. Maybe the wood is shifting, Ruth called softly from the porch, but her voice did not sound convinced. Ethan looked back at her. Did Walter ever mention something under the dock? Ruth hesitated. He said the lake kept what people were not ready to hold. I thought he was talking about grief. Maverick pressed his paw again. Tap. This time Ethan felt it through the plank, a small vibration traveling up into his palm. Not a knock from a person. Not an animal. More like something loose beneath the dock tapping wood whenever the water lifted it. Yet the timing felt too careful to be dismissed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out Walter's photograph. The blue arrow marked the last third of the dock, exactly where Maverick stood. The paper trembled in the cold breeze. Ethan compared the picture to the boards beneath him. The dock had aged, silvered, and shifted, but one post with a crooked metal bracket was still there, dark at the waterline. Walter had marked this place. Not the cabin. Not the fireplace. The dock. The sun dropped behind the pines, and the gold line over the lake faded into blue. Ethan knew better than to pull up boards in fading light with cold water below, and no proper tools. He stood, though every part of him wanted to keep going, and rested his hand on Maverick's head. Tomorrow morning, he said. The dog did not like it. He stayed with his paw on the bowed plank until Ethan gently called him back. Ruth offered to bring a lantern and dry blankets from her place across the cove, but Ethan thanked her and said he would manage. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if recognizing the kind of pride that needed kindness to approach quietly. Before she left, she placed a folded tarp and a small thermos on the porch. Walter would have wanted you warm while you were being stubborn, she said. After her station wagon disappeared into the trees, the cabin settled into evening. Ethan opened a can of soup, warmed it on the little stove, and gave Maverick his food beside the hearth. The room glowed amber from a battery lantern Ethan had taken from the truck. Shadows leaned across the walls. The photograph of young Walter on the mantel seemed to watch without judgment. Outside, Lake Wren darkened until it looked less like water and more like a piece of sky laid flat on the earth. Ethan tried to sleep in the cabin chair with his field jacket folded under his head, but rest would not come. The wind chime remained silent. The clock on the mantel stayed stopped at 2:17. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, Maverick rose. His tags gave the softest chime. Ethan opened his eyes at once. The German shepherd stood facing the back door, body still, ears forward. Beyond the window, the dock lay under moonlight, pale and narrow, leading into a lake so still it seemed sealed. Then the water near the middle post moved. One ring widened, then another. Tap. The sound came through the closed cabin door, barely there, but clear enough to make Ethan sit up slowly. Maverick looked back once, asking nothing, only reminding him of what he already knew. Ethan put on his boots, took the flashlight, and stepped into the cold. The air smelled of pine, wet boards, and moonlit water. At the dock, the bowed plank waited beneath a skin of frost. Maverick placed his paw on it again, and the tap answered from below, patient as a message that had survived every year it was ignored. By the time the eastern sky turned the color of ash, Ethan had already decided that the lake had waited long enough. He did not tear into the dock in the dark. He marked the bowed plank with a strip of blue tape from his toolbox, walked back to the cabin with Maverick close at his side, and sat awake until morning with Walter's photograph on his knee and the old clock on the mantel still stopped at 2:17. When the first pale light spread across Lake Wren, the mist lifted in slow ribbons from the surface, revealing the dock, the leaning posts, and the dark shallows below as if the whole place were offering itself one careful piece at a time. Ethan made coffee in the dented tin pot, fed Maverick, and carried his tools outside, a pry bar, a hand saw, a cordless drill, a coil of rope, work gloves, and an old towel. He moved with patience, not because he felt calm, but because Walter had left him a mystery wrapped in wood and water, and some gifts deserved to be opened with clean hands. Ruth Callahan arrived just after sunrise with a lantern, dry socks, and a small thermos tucked under one arm. She did not ask many questions. She only stood at the end of the dock, looked at the blue tape on the bowed plank, and whispered, "So that is where he meant." Ethan knelt and removed the screws one by one. They were rusted but not ruined, as if someone had loosened and tightened them over the years to make sure the secret did not become impossible to reach. When the last screw came free, Maverick stepped back without being told, sitting at the edge of the dock with his ears forward and his amber eyes fixed on the water below. Ethan lifted the plank. The smell that rose from beneath was not foul, only cold and old, lake water, wet cedar, iron, and the deep green scent of leaves resting under the surface. Beneath the opening, tied to the inside of a dock post with a length of dark rope, was a metal box about the size of a tackle case. It had been wrapped in oilcloth and sealed inside a clear waterproof sleeve that had clouded with age but held firm. The box moved gently whenever the lake breathed against the post. Tap. Tap. That was the sound, not a voice, not a warning, only the box touching the wood each time the water lifted it, patient through season after season until the right dog placed his paw above it. Ethan let out a breath he had not known he was holding. "Walter," he murmured, "what did you do?" Ruth crossed herself softly, not as a display, but as a habit born from years of awe and worry living in the same heart. Ethan looped the rope around his wrist, reached down into the cold water, and worked the knot loose with numb fingers. The lake was shallow there, barely more than 2 feet, but the cold went straight into his bones. Maverick leaned forward, watching every movement with silent discipline. When the box finally came free, Ethan lifted it onto the dock and wrapped it in the towel. No one spoke for several seconds. Water ran from the oilcloth in shining threads. The sun touched the tops of the pines, and the rusted wind chime on the porch gave one faint note behind them. Ethan peeled away the outer covering, then the waterproof sleeve. The metal box beneath was dark green, scratched but strong, with a brass clasp and a small plate engraved with Walter Bennett's initials. The tarnished key from the walnut box fit the lock perfectly. It turned with a stubborn click that sounded louder than it should have in the morning stillness. Inside lay a second key, smaller and older, a cassette tape in a plastic case, a folded cabin drawing, and a letter sealed in an envelope marked for Ethan, "When the water gives this back." Ethan looked at the words until they blurred slightly. Ruth placed a hand against the dock rail to steady herself. "He really believed you would come," she said. Ethan opened the drawing first because his hands were not ready for the letter. It showed the cabin from above, each room sketched with careful lines: porch, kitchen, main room, storage alcove, fireplace. Behind the fireplace, where the stone chimney widened into the back wall, Walter had drawn a narrow rectangle and marked it hidden room, dry wall panel, brass key. Ethan looked toward the cabin. The green door stood open now, the inside dim and waiting. Maverick rose at once, as if the drawing had spoken aloud. He walked down the dock, crossed the damp grass, and stopped at the cabin steps, looking back only once. Ethan placed the cassette tape, the letter, and the drawing against his chest and followed. Inside, the cabin seemed different in daylight, less abandoned than watchful. Dust floated in the beams of morning light. The fireplace stones were cool beneath Ethan's palm. He found the panel exactly where Walter had drawn it, hidden behind a narrow stack of cedar boards that looked decorative until he moved them aside. The small brass key slid into a lock so well concealed that only a man who had built it, or loved him, would know where to look. When the panel opened, a breath of dry cedar air moved into the room, and Maverick stepped forward, calm and certain, as if he had led Ethan not to an inheritance, but to the part of Walter that no one had managed to erase. The hidden room was no larger than a walk-in pantry, yet Ethan felt as if he had stepped into the center of Walter Bennett's heart. Dry cedar lined the walls from floor to ceiling, its scent preserved in the closed air like a memory that had refused to fade. A narrow table stood beneath a small battery lantern, still wrapped in wax paper. Beside it sat 3 metal file boxes, a cloth-covered tape player, a stack of yellow legal envelopes, and a row of framed photographs turned carefully toward the door. Maverick entered first, calm and reverent, his paws soundless on the old wood floor. He lowered his nose to the nearest file box, then looked back at Ethan with the quiet certainty that had carried them from the law office to the lake, from humiliation to this secret little room behind stone and ash. Ruth Callahan stood just outside the fireplace opening, one hand over her mouth, her eyes wet but steady. "I knew Walter kept something," she whispered, "but I never knew it was this." Ethan could not answer. He was looking at the photographs. Walter stood in several of them, younger, stronger, always near the green-doored cabin. In one picture, he was with 3 men on the dock, all of them smiling in that tired, careful way of people who have learned to be grateful without making too much noise about it. In another, he stood beside a small wooden sign that had never been placed outside. Lake Wren Home. A quiet place for those who need the water. Ethan touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers. The words were simple, but they opened something in him he had kept closed for years. Ruth stepped inside slowly and lifted the cloth from the tape player. The cassette from the metal box fit into it with a small plastic click. Ethan looked at her, and she nodded toward the chair. He sat because his knees had begun to feel uncertain beneath him. Maverick settled beside his boot, pressing close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of him through his jeans. Ruth pressed the button. At first there was only static, soft and thin, like wind moving through pine needles. Then Walter's voice filled the room. "Ethan, if you are hearing this, then the lake gave back what I asked it to keep." The old man's voice was weaker than Ethan remembered, but the kindness in it was unchanged. "I am sorry for the hurt you had to sit through. I know what that room sounded like. I know what it feels like when people use paper to tell a good man he does not belong. I let them read the public will because I needed them to stop looking. I needed greed to believe it had won, so it would walk away from the only thing I still had strength to protect." Ethan closed his eyes. The tape hissed softly, then Walter continued. "You were never written out of my love. You were hidden inside my trust. In the first file box, you will find a codicil signed before Harold Price and 2 witnesses, along with a recorded statement and a notarized letter. The cabin, the dock, the shoreline rights, and the repair account belong to you, but not for comfort alone. I am asking you to finish what I could not. Lake Wren was never meant to be a vacation place for people with too many houses. It was meant to be a resting place for veterans who had no quiet room, no safe porch, no morning that began with birds instead of worry." Ethan opened his eyes. Ruth was crying silently now, not with sorrow only, but with the relief of hearing a long-guarded truth finally spoken aloud. Maverick lifted his head when Walter's voice softened. "I chose you because you came to my house when there was nothing to gain. You fixed what was broken and left before I could make you take more money. You sat with me when the nights were long. You never asked what you were worth to me. That is why I trusted you with what mattered." There was a pause on the tape, a rustle of paper, a tired breath. And Ethan listened to Maverick. That dog always knew where silence was hiding the truth. The tape ended with a click that sounded final and gentle at the same time. No one moved. Sunlight from the main room reached through the open panel and fell across the file boxes in a narrow golden strip. Ethan opened the first box with careful hands. Inside were exactly the papers Walter had named, the signed codicil, the trust documents, bank statements for a modest but real repair fund, shoreline permits, and plans for 3 small sleeping cabins behind the main house. On top of them was a letter in Walter's hand. Ethan unfolded it, and the first line blurred before he could finish reading it. "A man does not need to inherit everything to know he was loved. He only needs to be trusted with one thing worth saving." Maverick rested his chin on Ethan's knee, and the rusted wind chime outside rang once in the still air. By noon, Harold Price was on the phone with Ruth Callahan standing beside him in the cabin kitchen, reading document numbers aloud while Ethan sat at the table with Walter's letter spread beneath his hands and Maverick lying across his boots. The old law office in Harbor Falls felt very far away now, as if it belonged to another life, one where silence had been used to make Ethan small. Here at Lake Wren, silence did the opposite. It widened around him. It gave him space to breathe. The signed codicil was valid, Harold said after 2 long calls, his voice coming through Ruth's speakerphone with a careful steadiness that could not hide his emotion. Walter had recorded the statement, filed the trust documents properly, and paid the shoreline fees 3 years in advance. The cabin and repair account are yours under the conditions he named. There may be objections, but the paperwork is strong. Ethan looked through the window toward the dock, where the replaced plank rested beside the old one like a wound already learning to close. "What are the conditions?" he asked, though he had already read them twice. Harold answered softly. "You maintain the property as Lake Wren home. You may live there as caretaker. You may not sell it for private profit. And whenever possible, you offer rest to veterans in need of a quiet place to recover their footing." The words settled over the room like morning light. Ethan did not feel richer. He felt trusted, which was heavier and holier than money. By evening, news had already moved through the family. Darren Bennett arrived in a black sport utility vehicle just as the sky began turning lavender over the lake. He stepped out wearing the same polished coat from the reading, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp ground, his face arranged in the kind of smile people use when they have not yet accepted defeat. Ethan met him on the porch with Maverick beside him. Ruth remained inside near the window, not hiding, simply witnessing. Darren spoke of confusion, misunderstandings, emotional manipulation, and the need to let attorneys handle things. Ethan listened without raising his voice. When Darren finally paused, Ethan handed him a copy of Walter's recorded statement transcript. The wind moved through the pines. The rusted chime trembled but did not ring. "Walter wanted the cabin to become a place of rest," Ethan said. "I am going to honor that." Darren looked past him at the peeling green door, the sagging dock, the moss on the roof, and for a moment his disappointment was almost honest. He had wanted property. He had missed purpose. He left before dark, and the lake accepted the sound of his engine until it faded completely into the trees. The work began the next morning. Not the grand kind of work that makes photographs look easy, but the slow, faithful work of boards, nails, permits, phone calls, sore hands, and coffee gone cold. Ethan repaired the roof first, patching the weak corner before the November rain could find it. Ruth brought soup in jars and introduced him to a retired electrician from the far side of the cove. Harold helped reopen Walter's trust account and sent copies of every document to the county. A church group from Harbor Falls donated mattresses. A lumberyard owner who had once known Walter delivered cedar planks at half price and pretended not to notice when Ethan's eyes grew wet. Maverick supervised everything with grave importance, walking the perimeter each morning, sitting by the dock when Ethan worked near the water, and sleeping at night beside the green door as if guarding Walter's promise from the dark. Winter came early, but the cabin held. Snow softened the pines and turned Lake Wren into a sheet of silver glass. Ethan slept in the small back room, not in his truck, and the first night he closed the real door behind himself, he stood with his hand on the knob for nearly a minute. Maverick watched from the braided rug, head tilted, tail sweeping once across the floor. "I know, boy," Ethan whispered. "It feels strange to be allowed to stay." By spring, the dock stood straight again. The wind chime had been cleaned but not replaced, because Ethan believed some scars deserved to keep their sound. Behind the cabin, the first 2 small guest rooms were framed beneath the pines, simple, warm, and facing east so morning light would enter gently. The first man to stay was named Paul Hensley, a quiet former Navy mechanic from Traverse City who arrived with 1 duffel bag, a stack of worn letters, and the uneasy look of someone prepared to be turned away. Ethan met him at the green door and handed him a key. "You can rest here," he said. "No explanation needed tonight." Paul looked toward the lake, then down at Maverick, who stepped forward and leaned gently against his leg. Something in the man's face loosened. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like they had traveled a long distance to arrive. That evening, as sunset laid gold across Lake Wren, Ethan sat on the porch with Maverick at his feet and watched light glow from the cabin windows. Ruth waved from the dock. Smoke rose from the chimney. Somewhere inside, Paul was making coffee, and the old rooms no longer felt abandoned. They felt occupied by mercy. The wind moved softly through the pines, and the chime rang once, clear and whole for the first time since Ethan had arrived. He looked at the water, at the repaired dock, at the green door Walter had kept waiting, and understood that being erased from one will had led him to a deeper inheritance. He had not been left out. He had been sent ahead to open the door.